This is probably a great transition from spring rates into valving.
Mm-hmm.
So why is it like that? Why can you put stiffer springs in a bike and have it feel softer? Not changing the valving.
Yeah, that's a more complicated, I think, than you think it is. There's a few factors that come into play there. So right away, whether it's a fork or a shock, both ends of the bike are on virtually any bike I've ever experienced are engineered so that as we get further into the stroke, they progressively become stiffer. So we have some bottoming control.
Yep.
So I mentioned it earlier about with that YZ450 valve for a customer of mine, I increased the oil volume in the outer fork cartridge. We have an air spring that functions in that fork. So as the fork compresses, air is infinitely progressive and it acts as a spring and we get some bottoming control.
Because the fork is a sealed unit.
Correct.
And as you increase that air spring, that air spring effect.
The fork's telescopic, so we're physically decreasing the volume inside the fork. So we're compressing the air, and air is a spring. So by having a fork that's undersprung, riding too deep in the stroke consistently, in layman's terms, you're effectively in that bottoming control part of the travel of the fork where things are really harsh and stiff. So if we can pick the fork up in the stroke to where that air spring's not effective anymore, now we're in a really plush part of the stroke. And the bike feels better. It's more compliant on square edges. Damping is not position sensitive. Springs are position sensitive. And the air spring is a spring. That is extremely position sensitive. So that's a fork.
Theoretically, infinitely progressive.
Yes, 100%. Now, in the shock, we have linkage. And the purpose of linkage is to accelerate shock shaft speed as we get deeper into the travel of the shock or the stroke of the shock. So for instance, if let's say hypothetically in the first inch of travel that the rear wheel moves, you'll compress your shock an inch. For conversation's sake, it's 1-to-1. Well, for the last inch of our travel, it might move the shock 4 inches. Okay. So if we kind of bring this all the way back to valving now, we haven't really got into valving, but orifice, we mentioned orifice style damping before, which an orifice is a hole and we're just pushing oil through a hole. The faster we try to push that oil through the hole, the more resistance we'll create. So if we accelerate that shock shaft speed, then in theory, we will have more resistance to movement or to motion. So that linkage creates bottoming resistance. And in
because the curve looks like this as it goes through the stroke.
Yeah, it's very linear in the initial. Probably, again, we can't put a number to this because we have aftermarket companies that build different types of linkage that can create a totally linear curve throughout the whole stroke and it has no bottoming resistance. Or we could have linkage that has a very progressive curve and it creates mid-stroke harshness. Right. So again, we're just speaking in general terms here, but for 2/3 of the travel in most dirt bikes, it's a very linear curve and the damping feels consistent through the travel. And at the end, we get that spike and we have some bottoming resistance so that when the bike does bottom out, then it's a cushioned bottom. And so having a bike, again, back to what our question was, if it's undersprung and riding too deep in the stroke, we're always in that bottoming control zone, just using the last third of the travel at the front and the back, and it just creates a very harsh ride.